Hello, everyone. Welcome to February. We're a month into the semester, and I still have yet to have a quality cheeseburger this. I'm in a mood. I want to take it out on you guys, but I have to take it on someone. Somebody want to volunteer? All right, Jared's going to do it. Yeah. He knew I was going to pick him anyway, so yeah. Yeah. So interesting story. I lived in Dallas for 5 years, and I got really spoiled because there were a lot of really good restaurants in Dallas because it's a metroplex of about I think 3 million people in the Dallas greater Fort Worth area. So a lot of opportunities there. And then I lived in Oklahoma and Stillwater. It was fine. I had some opportunities there, but then I moved out here. And, I said two things that I needed. I needed a Chick-fil-A and a place to get um, good hamburger. And first year, that's when they opened. After the first year I was here, that's why I opened the Chick-fil-A in the student union. That was like not here until after my first year. So I was excited about that. Then I discovered sea breeze. All my problems are solved. And I think that it's just kind of it's perspective. Like that I went for 2 years without a quality cheeseburger, and now I'm whining that I went for 1 month. Okay. So yeah, it's one of those little things, but it is that it's just a little thing. So I'm gonna do my best to get past that and get over myself. I should be in a much better mood on Friday when you next see me. You say, Dr. Barnes, when you next see me, we're gonna see you Tuesday and Thursday. I think of you as different people in the friends and stuff. No, we won't be in class on Wednesday, just as a reminder. That is FBLA day, and I guess looking at the weather, it looks like it's going to be reasonable weather. I'm always a little trepidatious. It's going to be cold, but it should be clear. So, like, I don't know if anybody of you remember last year, right around this time, last spring around this time, FBLA had to reschedule 2 different times because of the snow and the ice. So that's why I'm always a little bit antsy about scheduling. But it looks like we're going to be in for their good graces. So those of you who are volunteered, then you'll be here for the activities Wednesday morning. Those of you who are not, then I guess you'd sleep in a little bit, unless you got an 8:30 class. I can't do anything about that. Isn't there also like an 11:30 class? Yeah, okay. Is that business or data science? I'm so used to data science not being an actual scheduled class because it's been online for like so long, and Dr. Lou taking over this year's kind of. I am rambling. I apologize. Let's go ahead and get started with today's case. I don't think there's anything I know. Oh, by the way, I am going to hand back those CPA questions that we've done in class. I'll hand those back on Friday. I still want to look over the second set. I've looked over the first set, but I'll give those back just so you can have reference to the notes that you took. I did notice that several of you were not only writing down your explanations, but when I went through the explanation, were making additional notes on top of that. I encourage you to do that, especially if there's something that comes up that's important or relevant, regardless of whether you got the question correct, to make sure that you can refer back to those notes you're preparing. All right. So with that, let's go ahead and get started in this case. What was your thoughts on this case? I give you this case, and you say, Dr. Barnes says he wants us to become auditors, and then he gives us cases like this. It's a little bit like the whole wave exercise. We just did that in 417. You all remember the wave activity from 417? I end up that saying says, yeah, you guys are gonna have to make hard choices as auditors. Says, well, count me out. I don't want to make difficult choices. And then you kind of recover from that, and I give you this. It's like, oh, well, basically, I'm going to be sending my friends to prison. Great, thanks, Dr. Barnes. Yeah. Yeah, it's an unfortunate circumstance. It does come up, but this is more about a couple of important issues. Obviously, ethics does play a role in this one, but also the notion of professional skepticism and how the two conflict with one another. So, what's going on in this case? We got an auditor, which I'm blanking on his name, Will. I'll say about Will. He just started being an auditor. He's been a non-traditional student. He basically was working as a plumber full time, but was taking night classes or additional classes and got through. Took him like 7 years, but kudos to his diligence. And then I think I like his little statement about how he wanted to have a job where he showered before he went to work, out than after he went to work. My roommate's actually he works for the water facility over in Adair County, and he's kind of complained about the same thing because his job is very hands-on and technical. And I said, yeah, it's been a long time since I've done any hands-on technical jobs like that. So, yeah, my shower's always in the morning because I want to smell good for you guys. Yeah. don't care. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Yeah. So you got a newborn baby baby on the way, I believe it was. And basically, starting this gig where he's working. Then working in the town of Rosedale. And town of Rosedale, one of the clerks, or the clerk there, this is the clerk, was Jessica Randall, who is basically married to his best friend. And I don't remember what his best friend's real name was, but they call him Nacho in the case. Okay, and I've always wanted to have like a cool nickname that my friends call me. Now they just call me Gramps, actually, because I'm much older than they are. But that's true. That's actually an accurate statement. That's a true statement. And I feel like I'm getting older every single day. Anyway, so basically what's going on here is he's working with Jess, and Jess is very, very by the book when she's at work. And she's very, very kind and polite when she's outside of work, but by the rules and by the book. So he's doing some checking on cash or on payments, not cash receipts, but payments for tickets. And it's a sampling test. Basically, there's too many to test all of them. So it's testing a sample and picked up the sample. And the payments are different in nature. They might be by check or they may be a summer transaction, but some of them are by cash. And something he noticed is that the cash payments, he can't find the deposits for the cash payments. And so he wants to talk with Jessica, and Jessica says, oh, "That's weird. I wonder what happened." And then she said, "Oh, what happened is the bundle deposit that got knocked behind the cabinet, and the law was back there. Here's the $320." He's like, "Okay, cool." And that was the story, and that's all you had to learn from this case. And so, no, it was not quite that simple because Will noticed some things during the audit that were kind of suspicious, because some things that were inexplicable. So the first one that I thought was interesting. So he basically was kind of like saying that's a reasonable explanation, and that's what we want to buy into. We want to buy into that explanation because we don't want to believe things are wrong, especially when it's somebody that we're close to and we care about. So he basically said, "Okay, that's a reasonable explanation." And look, and says that's strange because the original list of the cash or the payment receipts was written in black ink, and the deposits was written in blue ink, or maybe it was the other way around, but they were different colors of ink. Like, wouldn't she have made those at the exact same time? It says there's a possible explanation. Could be one of those people that only does one color pin for some task and one other pin for other tasks, which sounds far-fetched, but I do know individuals who've done that. So that's a possibility, all right? But there was one other explanation that was really hard to get behind. What was that explanation? The dates on the bills. Like, so if you ever look on your bills, like they're not saying pull out the bills right now, but they actually tell you what year they're printed. And so this case was supposed to be taking place in 2000, or the fiscal year was 2005. He was doing the audit in 2006, but fiscal year 2005, and looked at the bills, and they were printed, spanking new, printed in 2006. So how do cash payments that are supposed to have taken place in 2005 come from 2006 series bills? The answer is Jess had a time machine. All right, Jess had a time machine. No, there was something shady going on. So calls in the partner and says, "Yeah, we got a problem here." They started doing the checks on all the other cash payments, and they started noticing that all the cash payments had a similar situation, is that they were reported as being paid, but there was no evidence of deposits. So yeah, that's when kind of everything fell apart. And without going into much detail, turns out that Jess was embezzling from the government and was found guilty. She proclaimed her innocence very, very long, and then at the very end of the case, she finally admitted and broke down. She had a gambling addiction, and she needed the money because she was only making $18,000 a year. And keep in mind, this was written in a small town in the early 2000s, technically the late 2000s. So even you may say only $18,000 a year. It's like, well, that's still not very much money back then, but it's more reasonable 20 years ago than it is today. But yeah, $18,000, and then basically kind of had a fractured relationship with Nacho. He couldn't sleep, and all these things going on. It was just kind of awkward and a bad situation. And so you probably read this case. It's like, I don't want to read any more of Dr. Martin's cases, and that's fair. That is fair. I make you read the tough stuff up front because the later stuff is a little bit more boring and engaging. I'm just curious. This is not going to have any effect on your grade whatsoever. You don't have to respond if you don't want to. But how many of you would rather read a case like this that is more about emotions and feelings than a really, really highly technical case than the one we read the previous week, where focused on auditing standards and how to read through technical detail? you rather read something that's kind of more narrative based? Okay, all right. So even though it makes you feel bad in the end, you're just kind of like, okay, at least I was emotionally drawn to this. It's like a Netflix series, but in written, Yeah, yeah. So yeah. Okay, so there were some lessons to be learned from this. And what I'd like to do is I only had you respond to a couple of the questions, but I wanted to talk about all these questions because I think there's some interesting points to be related to. So I want to talk through these, and I've got some solutions that I'm going to refer to, but the simple truth is I think that we're at the point now that we should be able to articulate some of these things pretty easily. And if we can't, then we need to understand the resources that we refer to get to this information. So the first question basically says, what is professional skepticism? We've talked about professional skepticism many times. In this class, we've talked about it back in 417. But what is professional skepticism? And so there's actually a statement on auditing standards, number 99. This was written back in actually the early 2000s, right around the time of the Enron debacle and WorldCom. It has to do with auditors' responsibility for fraud. And it goes on to explicitly state professional skepticism as it relates to fraud. So professional skepticism at a very general level, when we talk about it with respect to auditing or just our profession, we use the term questioning mind. Does everybody remember that? The idea of keeping a questioning mind. Don't ever accept anything at face value. Basically, always make sure that you have some sort of rigor in your procedures to prove what it is you believe. Be skeptical of everything. So that's kind of the idea that we talked about before. But Statements on Auditing Standards number 99 goes into a little bit more detail. Says professional skepticism should lead the audit team members to continually be alert for information or other conditions that indicate material misstatement due to fraud that may have occurred. So basically, we need to be constantly aware, constantly vigilant of these possibilities that could lead to fraud. And we can't accept them. We can't accept anything at face value. And again, that goes back to the original explanation. So professional skepticism, core foundation, core principle of our profession. We need to understand that we have to be professionally skeptical in order to make sure that we don't have any problems that occur go undetected or unidentified. Now, is it in our nature to be professional skeptical about all things? It's about some things, not necessarily about all things. How professionally skeptical are you about your education, for example? I get up here and I start saying things, and sometimes it's very obvious that you don't want to listen to a word I say. But sometimes I start talking and I say something, and you say, "Oh, that makes perfect sense." And I realize, "Oh, that was wrong. It's actually the opposite of that." And you're like, "Well, I'm glad you told me because I would have accepted what you told me at face value, Dr. Barnes." Is that professionally skeptical? How frequently you're professionally skeptical about the things that your educators say? Probably not that much. You probably accept what they say because that's what you're paying. You're paying to tell the truth. Have I ever lied to you before? Many, many times, okay? Many, many times. It's actually deliberate. I deliberately lie to you to see if people are being skeptical about things I'm saying. Usually it's a very, very outrageous one. It's like saying, okay, so the audit reports don't in fact mention reasonable assurance at all, do they? And you're just like saying, yeah, I'm pretty sure they do, Dr. Barnes. So you say, no, I'm skeptical about that. So to some degree you are skeptical. In some situations you're not skeptical. And there may be other instructors who just tell you from a fact-based perspective saying, this is everything you need to know. I'm never going to try to fool you. You still need to be skeptical about what they say because what they're trying to tell you is going to engage critical thinking aspects, and they may not always be correct. Has anybody ever had another instructor other than me who is going to lie to you on occasion? Has anybody ever had another instructor tell you something that was wrong and they come back and say, I was wrong about this, let me tell you why? Is that something that kind of tells you, oh, I probably should be more skeptical? Or do you say, well, they weren't really trying to tell me something that was wrong, it was just a mistake? Does that kind of bypass this idea of being professionally skeptical if we accept people's explanations for why they might be wrong? Now, I know that there's no malice and there's no intent in that. There's no intent to try to tell the truth. Like Dr. Otero would never deliberately lie to me. And you don't know her very well if that's the case, okay? You can tell I said that. Yeah. So, yeah. Dr. Otero would never deliberately lie to me, but you still need to be skeptical because we're not necessarily talking about deliberate falsehoods, deliberate misperceptions. We're talking about anything that might lead to a misstatement. And so it's important for us to basically be on our toes and make sure we question everything, regardless of whether the thing is correct or not. So some examples of Will's professional skepticism in this case. There's plenty of examples in this case. So what are some examples that we've talked about? Did he just accept Jess's explanation at face value? No, he basically said, well, I still have to check this. you're the wife of my bestie, and I'm cool with that, but I've got a job as an auditor. I have to check that. So didn't necessarily just accept the explanation, and then kind of walked into that. That's kind of the big one right there. Any other examples that you identified?
Be an example like at the very beginning when he kind of raised the concern to the partner about his relationship.
Good, good. Yeah. So, yeah, about the relationship. And so, a partner said it's not a big deal, but he was saying, okay, I've got to make sure that my relationship is clean, that I can actually still do this audit. Good identification. Any others?
He refers to Jess as work Jess, and he kind of questions the fact that like she's so uptight at work, but when they're out in public, she's like kind of loosey goosey.
Yeah, and so there is kind of a philosophy that some people are different in work and in their personal lives, and that does exist for some people. But there might be another explanation. It's like, okay, I'm outside. There's nothing. There's nothing I have to defend against. There's not an attack. If I'm at work, this auditor is trying to attack me, and I have to defend myself because I have something to hide. So there's definitely something to read into there. What you got, Ben?
Did you say like when he expanded the testing, like pulling more cash receipts? That'd be
Yeah, so expanding the testing, basically saying, okay, I can't just accept what I've identified at face value. I do need to know that procedures extend out for a certain range. And so identifying that and saying this is my responsibility. That's definitely a good example. So very good examples there. Well done. So what are some conditions present that could have limited Will's skepticism, and what might have done if he'd not? What might Will have done if he'd not been exercised professional skepticism? So we can answer the last question first. The easy one is just basically say accept Jess's explanation. Say, all right, I don't want to be skeptical about this. She's my friend. She's not doing anything wrong. I'm going to accept that. I think that's kind of the ultimate conclusion. There's a lot of other conclusions we can reach, but that's kind of the big one. What are some conditions present in the case that could have limited Will's skepticism? Now, I think the biggest one, you're dealing with a friend there. That's going to be the easiest one to identify. But are there other conditions that you think you could identify in this situation? There's one that I think is kind of important to note. So how many of you have heard the term budget before with respect to auditing? I know you've heard the term budget before because that's one of the things that Dr. Otero talks about. It's not all just materials, labor, and overhead, despite what I say. So there's that idea of budgeting. So is budgeting an important concern in public accounting? Yeah. So an engagement comes in and said, this is what we expect to spend on the engagement versus what we expect to come in to take in. And hopefully there's a big delta between those because we want to make money on the engagement. But it's important to keep up to the budget. Do budgets put a pressure on the person conducting the audit? If I tell you you're only supposed to spend 5 hours testing here, and then you get to 5 hours and you're not done testing, what are you going to be doing? You're going to be panicking, saying, I don't know why it took me longer than 5 hours. Are there situations where we might want to move past the scope of budgeting that we've allocated? Like if there's fraud occurring in that situation, the partner's saying, oh my gosh, we're going to blow the budget on this one for something that's completely and totally ridiculous. I hate to tell you this, but that's kind of the way managers and partners are. They are very focused on budgeting. It's one of those things that will drive you up a wall. So there could be one of that threat present. Now, it turns out that the budget was kind of a useless constraint here because there was a lot more work to be done, and there was something that came out of it. But that might have limited the professional skepticism. Say, well, this is probably not material. I've got a budget to consider. I can just move on. And that might have been outside of the considerations of any friendship existing. All right, so here's one that I had you all answer. So consider auditor independence rules. What do generally accepted auditing standards say, or what do generally accepted auditing standards require regarding independence? So do the generally accepted auditing standards say anything about independence? We haven't really talked about those, but could you find those through a search online? Actually, here's an interesting question. Could you find them on Wikipedia? You can find anything on Wikipedia. No, actually, there's a good blog on Wikipedia talks about generally accepted auditing standards and discusses some of their history. But interestingly, there's the 3 areas that I've talked about before: is general, field work, and reporting. And if you look at general number 2, it says in all matters relating to assignment, independence of mental attitude is to be maintained by the auditor or auditors. That's the requirement according to generally accepted auditing standards. So the answer is 1, it's on Wikipedia. Okay. 2, independence in mental attitude is what is required. Now, this is an important distinction that we need to make, but let's move on to the questions, okay? So the second part says, what is independence in appearance and how is it achieved? All right, so what is independence in appearance and how is it achieved? Now, you will notice that we did not say independence in appearance in the requirement for generally accepted auditing standards. So the first thing you need to note, that was not the statement that was required under GAS. It said independence and mental attitude. This is referring specifically to independence and appearance. Now, have you heard that term before, independence and appearance? Probably so, because I've said it a few times. Maybe not as much time as I've said professional skepticism. But I've used the term independence in fact and appearance in other courses before. The auditor has to be independent in both fact and appearance. Now, independence in fact is pretty obvious. You have to follow the rules of the Code of Professional Conduct. But independence in appearance is pretty much, you also have to appear like you're independent. You have to be, so there's described in a previous research article, independence in appearance is the result of others' interpretations of independence. So even if you are perfectly independent of your client, but you don't look like you're independent of the client, that can skew other people's perceptions of independence. Now, you may say that's kind of irrelevant, Dr. Barnes, because if I actually am independent, then isn't that all that really matters? And I'm going to ask you a question with a question, okay? Is it possible that people can perceive bad intentions even if you have no bad intentions? Yes, that's actually just the nature of humanity right there, okay? People assume bad intentions where they don't have full information. So you do need to make sure that not only do you actually operate independent in fact, but you also have independent appearance. Now, is that a problem in this case? Independence and appearance is going to be very, very challenging in this case because you may be auditing and somebody in the office is like saying, okay, there's the auditor talking to the clerk. Okay. So it looks like they're very, very diligent and very forthright in business. And then that same person goes out on a Friday night and sees them hanging out together. It's like, there may be an independence issue here. All right. Now, independence in fact still maintained. Independence in appearance, not so much. So does the Code of Professional Conduct address the issues of personal client relationships? Why or why not? So you had to refer to the Code of Professional Conduct, which I provided the slides on Brightspace to refer to, but you could have also looked online. So here's an interesting question. We're just going to answer this as a yes or no question. How many people think the Code of Professional Conduct does address personal client relationships? How many people think it doesn't? How many people are afraid to answer? Well, okay, you got to that point now. It does not, in fact, address the issue of personal client relationships. It alludes to relationships, but it does not specifically address it. Okay, it does not specifically address the issue of personal client relationships. Now, it's interesting to understand why or why not that's the case. And the answer is because it's very, very hard to distinguish what dictates a personal client relationship. Like, how close do you have to be to a client before you think that that's a relationship? Like if I say hi to somebody walking through the build office center every morning, is that a relationship? If I know their first name, is that a relationship? If I am the godfather of their children, is that a relationship? All right. So some of those you're going to answer yes, no, but eventually there becomes a dividing line, and we don't know what that dividing line is, and it's going to be different for different people, which is why there's not necessarily criteria, simply because trying to establish some arbitrary criteria might be a challenge. So the CPC basically says this is one of those subjective things that you have to use judgment on, which is very frustrating, but I also think is very appropriate in this situation. Now, compare independence and mental attitude to independence and appearance. So independence and mental attitude and independence and appearance, are these the same thing? Can you be independent in mental attitude but not be independent in appearance? Yes, all right. So it's certainly possible that's the case. Why, if that's the case, why do we so insistent that we have to maintain independence in appearance? Well, all we care really about is whether you're actually independent. If you're independent in mental attitude, which would be kind of independence in fact. Why do we care about independence in appearance? Well, let me ask you this, okay? Let me ask you to try to answer the question. If I ask you to try to provide some sort of objective measure of independence, would you try to measure independence in fact or independence in appearance? Like, let's say I want you to go to some arbitrary person in the class, and I would say, measure independence from Dr. Barnes, okay? Would you try to find some objective measure of how in fact measure their independence and mental attitude is? Or would you look at kind of their existing relationship with me and say, that's kind of the metric that I would use to gauge their independence? Yeah. Because it's really, really difficult to measure independence and mental attitude, because you can say, okay, answer some questions as honestly as you can. You can't guarantee that they're going to answer honestly. You can't even guarantee those are going to be good measures of their true independence and mental attitude. So oftentimes when we think about independence, we usually use independence and appearance as a measurement gauge to evaluate independence, which is why independence in fact and appearance is such an important metric. So what do we think about Will's independence in this case? Now, there's two ways we can answer this question. Will's independence and appearance. What do you all think about that? Is Will independent in appearance? No, okay. And that's a real big problem because there's always going to be questions about whether Will did sufficient work. So Will needs to be fully independent in mental attitude, independent in fact. Now, if you were to engage or we were to look at this now, keep in mind you're operating from the eye of God here, okay? You're looking from this case saying, I know what Will's thinking. I know what all the situations and circumstances are. I know exactly what's going on in Will's mind, okay? If you had that opportunity, then first of all, if we can do that as auditors, that would be a big violation of privacy. But that would be a really good way for us to judge independence in fact. So in independence in fact, in this independence and mental attitude, is Will independent? Did he operate with true independence in this regard? Yes, and I think that's a great argument to make for that, okay? So even though there's a deviation there, we can say that Will's independence in fact was present. So in your opinion, what factor plays the greatest role in determining auditor independence? Now, this one's one that's more subjective. There's no correct answer to this. But what were you thinking when you say, what provides the greatest determination of independence? If you were to say, what is it about me, not me, but Dr. Barnes, but you yourself, I'm talking as you, which again is really weird, but about me, what is it about me that would basically determine my independence in a given issue? What would you say that single factor might be? Obviously, your appetite, okay? How much you enjoy cheeseburgers. All right, so let's go. What are some basic qualities that we can talk about with human beings that we think that would determine independence? Honesty, integrity, okay, objectivity. So that's kind of the direction they're going for this question, and say that the answer key actually says integrity, but there's multiple different perspectives you can take on that. But I think it's some variation of integrity. Do you do your job with the necessary diligence and forthright attitude that you should have? Do you make sure that you're doing your job properly in all circumstances? It doesn't matter if you're dealing with somebody you don't know or dealing with somebody you do know, you do the same thing every single time. You're consistent. I think that is going to be the measurement of independence. So last part of this question, what do you think the profession should do to promote independence in light of your answer to the previous question? So at your point right now where you're at, okay, what is the most important determinant of your independence? Aside from your own personal characteristics, again, I know that a big part of this is going to be who you are. I could be talking to somebody in this room that's basically cheated on every exam they've ever taken and me not know about it. If you've done that, by the way, kudos. That's pretty impressive. All right. All right. But yeah, I could be talking to somebody whose integrity is completely, totally skewed and says, I'm not ever becoming honest, not for you or anyone else, Dr. Barnes. I don't care how much you care. But some part of that is innate. But is there something else that we could identify that's going to determine independence? Well, certainly characteristics of behavior are what it is you need to do to be independent, what independence represents, that it needs to be good education. But also, to a lesser degree, you need to understand not just what it is that you need to do as part of your job or your diligence, how honest you need to be, but you also need to understand how others will perceive you. Part of this discussion right here, when we talk about independence and appearance, is trying to say others will perceive you differently than you're trying to promote yourself. Like, people will look at you and have certain interpretations, certain impressions of who you are and what it is that you're doing. You need to be aware of others' expectations. I'm not saying that you need to succumb to others' expectations, except when it comes down to being independent in appearance and in certain engagements, because that is the metric they will judge you by. All right. When we look out of the money, you know the evidence was stacking in favor of explanations being very uncomfortable. Make a detailed list in support of Jess's position and all evidence refuting Jess's claim that the money had fallen between the cabinets. Also identify the type of evidence each item listed. It says detailed list. The solution actually only gives 5 different arguments in there, and some of them overlap, okay? So let's go ahead and just see if we can do this, all right? So what is the basis, the very first basis point that we as an auditor would look at and say, all right, here's evidence that either supports or refutes this contention. So we think, all right, we're missing some money. Can you provide an explanation for this? And what did Jess do? That, oh, the money was probably lost. It probably just got misplaced somewhere. So is that a piece of evidence? Yeah, what type of evidence do we call that, by the way, from an audit perspective? Well, we're talking with somebody, so it's inquiry, yeah, or inquiry, okay. Now, how strong evidence is that? Not very good, because people can lie when they're inquiry. In fact, Jess did lie, all right? So it's important to note, all right. Let's also talk about another piece of evidence that supports this. Okay, so you had the inquiry and you're like, okay, I'm really, really troubled by this. And then Jess shows up the next day. Look, cash. Okay, I looked behind the desk. Can you believe it? It was right there. Is that also evidence? Yes. And so the presence of that, what would that type of evidence be? Cash is a tangible asset, so we can say it's an inspection of tangible asset. Not a traditional inspection of tangible assets, because we usually reserve that for large assets, but still we can say it's a tangible asset, which provides a lot of stronger evidence. The problem is the caveat, if it's strong evidence, then any problem with that also is going to be stronger evidence that refutes in that other direction. Because there was a problem with the cash that we've already discussed. What's the problem with the cash? The dates on the bills were problematic. The dates on the bills, they were serialized for 2006, so they came out for it. So that kind of took that evidence that we said was in support and then put it in the refutes column very, very heavily. Is there any other evidence that we can actually point to? So what was the original cause for the question in the first place? There was no deposit information. There was no deposit information. That's what would we call that when we look at accounting records and we can't find a record that we're looking for. So it's an inspection of records and documents. Yeah, inspection of records and documents, which again, not real high reliability, about medium reliability, which caused our purpose of the inquiry in the first place. What was another piece of information, another piece of evidence that kind of refuted Jess's explanation? It's another inspection of documents.
The ink.
The ink, yeah. Color of the ink. Color of the ink, yeah. So I think in our column, when we look at the evidence and we weigh that kind of impartially, we can kind of say the evidence is stacking up against Jess. Jess's explanation does hold some water, but not very much. All right, so some controls that could have been helped to prevent and detect the theft that have been in place. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this question. First of all, because we're going to deal with controls independently of this, we're going to talk about the concept of controls. We've actually got a big controls case. We're going to be talking about testing controls. Secondly, from a conceptual standpoint, I think everybody already knows the controls. Specifically, there was one big one that was really absent that we can say, yeah, Dr. Barnes set us up for this one. Which one is it? You said it almost in unison. That was beautiful. Okay. So I'm going to have you all sing segregation of duties. The exact tone and that exact pitch. All right. It's going to be great. It's going to be great. Yeah. Segregation of duties. It appears that Jess was able to actually have custody and recording of the transactions without any real oversight or responsibility. So that's certainly problematic. There's probably other controls we can actually identify there. Lack of supervisor role over the deposits, lack of review of the documentation, inspection of the deposits to make sure that they are confirmed in the situation. Certainly problematic in that area. All right. After Vince and Will examined 8 more tickets, clear to them there's a problem with the tickets paid in cash. The case states they went back to office to discuss how they proceed. What might auditors have done to this meeting? Make a list of steps the auditor might have taken to bring the audit to a successful conclusion. By the way, when you read these other questions, is it obvious why I only gave you questions 2 and 7? I do enjoy cases like this. I don't enjoy the questions in a case like this. And I'm sure that this was a question that was written to satisfy a reviewer. Somebody said, all right, well, there needs to be a little bit more routine, a little bit more effort put on there. I mean, my experience with this is questions like this are not productive because people will just basically say, all right, I just need to put some quiet answers on there and I'll be done with it. And they don't really think about this. What I would like to do here, okay, is I don't want to make a list of steps, all right, because first of all, I don't think that this would be a formal process. I don't think that the partner would say, all right, let's pull up this checklist for situations that happen whenever we have a missing deposit. That's not going to be the way it is. The partner is going to say, let's brainstorm about this. What are some things? So let's just think about this. And I want to do 1 or 2 of these. And I want to say, I'm the partner. You're playing Will. And say, what do you think we should do moving forward? And I just want you to say the first thing that comes to your mind. I don't care how ridiculous it is. Unless it's something about cheeseburgers, please don't do that, okay? So what's the first thing that comes to your mind? What's the kind of top of your head? Obviously, we need to expand our testing. We need to do a lot more because something's not making sense here. Plus, it's like, I think there's a fraud. Okay, that's the first thing that comes to mind for me. Anybody come up with something different? Like saying, all right, should I be taken off this engagement? I think I'm compromised here. This is somebody who's a friend of mine. I don't think I can handle this objectively anymore. It's Groundhog Day. Did Bugsy Tony Phil see his shadow? All right. I don't know what I think about that. Actually, there's a reason I'm thinking about that, but I won't get into it because that's a waste of time. All right. So, yeah. So I think these are all legitimate questions to ask, and I think that those are things to explore. And how we go into the detail on this is we say, all right, once we've identified the question, what is the approach to have the question? It's never going to be an obvious yes or no. So let's deal with one of these questions, okay? Let's deal with one of these questions because this is kind of a difficult challenge. Should Will have been taken off this engagement? If I'm in Will's stage, like, hell yeah, get me off this engagement. This is more than I bargained for. What are some arguments for? Because, like, obviously, Will is compromised in his independence and appearance. Probably his independence and mental attitude, too. It doesn't really know that he can consider pursuing this any further. But, yeah, so there's definitely that. What are some arguments against?
He's shown the necessary steps to prove that he is kind of independent in mental attitude.
Yeah, so he's done his job diligently. He's done his job properly, correctly. The partner can see that. Says, all right, if you weren't independent, you wouldn't have ratted out one of your friends. All right. Also, who's going to be in a position to know more about the details of this case? Somebody new rolling onto it or Will? Will. That's often the time the way we try not to get people to rotate those engagements. That's actually an argument for the PCOB independence rule. So does everybody know the PCOB independence rule for partners on engagements? Partner can only be on an engagement for a 5-year period that they have to rotate off of some other partner. All right. And so the argument that the PCO or a lot of people against the PCOB is like they should change auditors after a 5-year period. They should actually just change audit firms. Now, from an independence perspective, it does make sense. What is the problem with that? You've got a new auditor that's got to come in and relearn the whole process all over again. And that is not an insignificant cost. And both monetarily and opportunity cost, we consider that. So anything we talk about where additional work is involved, additional effort, we have to think about the cost associated with that. And this would be something that would be substantial. By the way, would cost be a consideration in this circumstance? Probably to some degree, but what would happen in the situation with the auditor if they say, all right, fraud is occurring? At that point, cost constraints go out the window. It says we've got to do what we have to do to make sure that we've identified the scope of this problem. And they probably would be able to say, you know, that original fee that we assessed you, that estimate, yeah, that's out the window because we have to do more work for things we weren't expected to happen here. So at the point where we think about the budget, we think about whether the budget constraints are being lacked. If we identify a fraud, we're going to have to go to our client. We're going to have to say, yeah, take that engagement letter, toss it out the window. We're writing a new engagement letter here. Okay, it's going to reflect the fact that we have to investigate a fraud. Discuss the pressures that Will faced in pursuing this matter. Discuss the pressures the auditors faced in general dealing with misappropriation assets and fraudulent financial reporting. So I think we've gone into a lot more detail, a lot of extent on this. There's definitely a lot of pressure associated with this. Not just the fact that he had an existing relationship with somebody at the client, but also it was very, very large. It was very, very pressure engagement, high pressure engagement for the fact that he was in a personal environment that had his own personal existing pressures with his family life, with the amount of work that he was doing, the time that he was spending away from his wife. There was also the fact that it was the budget that was always a big concern. So yeah, there's definitely a series of pressures here. With respect to a fraud, how challenging is it for a fraud if you just say that we're investigating a fraud and you have no idea who the client is, no idea who the individual is, you have no relationship with it, you're trying to investigate it dispassionately. Are there still pressures present? Obviously, okay. Obviously, there's going to be pressures present. I mean, so some of these are going to be the same thing. We're going to be talking about the personal pressures that you face on a day-to-day basis. I'm assuming that everybody's got a little bit of stress in their life. I don't think you'd be Truman students if you didn't have a little bit of stress. I've got a philosophy that Truman students are kind of like this, like I enjoy a little bit of stress, just a little bit, not a lot. Sometimes it extends beyond that, but they handle it pretty well. I think a little bit of stress is healthy, a little bit too much stress, that's the problem. Okay. But yeah, you've got natural stresses in your own life that ebb and flow from time to time. Stresses associated with the engagement, the budget, the amount of work that you have to do. What about the fact that you have to work on an engagement, you have to work with individuals? So we've talked a little bit about this in forensics already, but going just beyond the scope of forensics, how easy is it to go to somebody that you don't know and say, I've got some suspicions that there may be fraud going on here, and one of the people you're talking to might be a suspect? Is that an easy conversation to have? As somebody who's had multiple conversations with students that I expect are suspected of cheating, I still don't enjoy that conversation. I've done it probably a dozen times now at Truman, which, by the way, is not an indictment of Truman. I had just about as many suspicions of cheating in like 6 semesters of teaching in my old university. Okay. Truman students by and large are very, very forthright, engaging. And the ones that I had to have discussions with, they're kind of represent the minority rather than the rule. So I want you to know right here, since this is being recorded, I'm not indicting Truman saying it's full of a bunch of cheaters. No, very, very diligent students. And I would say the majority of the students I was talking to, they didn't do it because they thought it was something that they were trying to get ahead. They had a conscience about it, but they were just kind of like, I didn't know what else to do. I was just really, really it was problematic. So yeah, it's not an easy conversation to have when you suspect somebody of committing fraud, and how to actually get to that point. Now, if we're getting to the interrogation phase, that's probably outside of the scope of the auditor. But we're talking about the evidence gathering phase. That's something you might be expected to do. If you're trying to gather evidence about a fraud, and you have to engage with somebody you suspect of the fraud, trying to say, yeah, I need evidence of this, and then fighting against you, saying, what are you trying to say about me? What are you trying to imply here? That's never a pleasant conversation to have. Never. So certainly difficult in that, which again, one of the reasons I apologize for giving you this case, because I know that that's not a pleasant thing to think about. So last part, this is one that I had you all answer. Let's go ahead. Let's talk about ethical decision-making models. So ethical decision-making models say that you're going to have to identify alternatives. And I will be scrutinizing these when I evaluate the cases. So just for context, part of this case is something, the reason that I had you I list this out is that part of this case is an assessment for the university. Now, I'm not going to share your names of the assessment, but I do scrutinize this as part of the assessment of the class. So if you kind of phone this in, then I'm just going to be saying, yeah, they phoned it in. Yeah, but I'm assuming nobody did that. Everybody was very, very diligent and forthright on this. And the idea being is that we're going to be assessing your ethical decision-making capacities, right? And I don't know if anybody had heard about this from the university. This is something we do in pretty much all the courses that we assess different collection points. So this is one of those ones for ethical decision-making. Now, again, if you're kind of like saying, Dr. Barnes going to be reporting my ethics, the answer is I'm going to be reporting 14 anonymous students' ethics. Okay. So yeah, that's going to be something we're talking about. So one of the things that we think about when we think about ethical decision-making is we're going to be talking about identifying alternatives and identifying possible consequences of each alternative. So in order to answer this question, you had to identify the alternatives. Now, I didn't specify how many alternatives you can identify. I think there's multiple different directions. I would hope at least two, because it's very difficult to say that there's an alternative when you only give one option, okay? That would be a bad rating on my evaluation, by the way, if you only gave one alternative. It's like, always tell the truth. It's like, good integrity to you, bad ethics. Good integrity, but bad ethics, all right? So, what are some alternatives? What is the first default alternative that we can identify in this case? Now, when I say default, what does that mean? It means given absent any other considerations, what was happening in the case. Do exactly as Will did, okay? Be completely and totally honest. Do everything that needs to do to make sure that he does his job as an auditor. What were the consequences of that action? The consequences sucked. He was stressed out. He couldn't sleep. One of his best friends lost her job and then had to pay restitution and then had a breakdown. Okay. So certainly not really great. So the consequences of that action were really problematic. Now, ultimately, did it end up for the best? Okay. We can say that if we look far enough in the future, this is something that had to happen. If it didn't happen now, it's going to happen later. Okay. Now, we're going to hold that in mind because that may be relevant to the rest of the alternatives we talked about. Okay. So now let's talk about some other possible alternatives. Okay. What might be one alternative that Will could have done other than what he actually did? Ignore it. Basically say, oh, that explanation is good enough for me and move on with your life. Is there good rationalization for doing that? When I say rationalization, I'm not meaning in broad terms. I mean just the neural rationalization that we as humans operate with. Probably not material, probably not a big issue. By the way, was this a material fraud? Anybody capture that? It was a material fraud because it was $21,000 over 2 years. The materiality threshold for the engagement was $5,000. So it didn't appear material, but after the investigation, it came out to be material. But at face value, it's like, it's just $300 something. It's not going to matter. I'm just not going to mess with it. I'll accept our explanation. Okay, what are the consequences of that?
Went unnoticed or would go unnoticed.
Would go unnoticed. Would it probably perpetually go unnoticed? What do we know about fraud that we've talked about in forensics? Something about self-perpetuation. And what is the other word I use with self-perpetuation? Escalation. Escalation. So remember Rita Crundwell? Remember Rita Crundwell's essential service? $181,000 in the first year. So that was easy. I can do better than that next year. You know, 200 something thousand dollars the next year. I don't know what the next second year was because it doesn't tell those statistics, but it just basically says in the last year's the fraud, she was still like $5 million a year. All right. Because basically what happens is when people commit fraud and they get away with small amounts, they think, oh, well, I can continue doing that more. Nobody's paying attention. Now, there may be a caveat to that in this case. Jess was kind of limited by the cash deposits. And if she stole every single cash deposit came through, it's still only going to reach a certain threshold. So there may be an area for additional fraud in some areas, but that was kind of the scope of the fraud in this particular case. And to our knowledge, she stole all the cash deposits. So that was kind of the scale for that. So yeah, probably would have eventually happened. What do we know about fraud when we talk about fraud detection with respect to responsibility to auditors? If the fraud gets large enough, is that going to have an impact on the entity that's being audited? Yeah, we actually have a direct correlation to this because this is a municipality. We know exactly what happened to Dixon, Illinois. We know that they were giving up infrastructure. They basically were taking out loans because of the scope of the fraud. This is not nearly as severe as that, but there was an impact to the fraud. There definitely was a discernible measurement of problems with fraud. Those were resources that should have been used elsewhere. It should have been parlayed into something. What about reputation concerns? So Jess basically is going to have kind of her career wrecked and she was under house arrest. If this had gone on for long enough, would it have been much, much more problematic? She had been like a 20-year fraudster like Rita Crunwell. She probably would have spent significant time in jail. All right. Is there a middle ground? There's a middle ground. So an alternative, we can say a middle ground. So our one ground is saying do exactly what Will did, which is basically the extreme, saying I'm going to do everything right. Other extremes like I'm going to do everything wrong. I'm going to ignore it. What's the middle ground? Well, accept Jess's word is kind of what we just did. So go to Jess and say, look, I'm not saying you're committing fraud, but if you were committing fraud, you can get into a lot of trouble. Probably should stop right now. And then basically move on, okay? Now, that's kind of the same thing as basically instead of accepting Jess's word, saying, look, I know you're doing something wrong. You shouldn't be doing something wrong. Now, that sounds like a much easier approach. It's a really, really challenging conversation to initially have, but at least you're not having to do the investigation, not making the partner mad. What is the consequence of this particular action? Well, first of all, Jess could ignore you and just basically say, well, I'm not actually committing fraud. So screw you. Yeah, whatever. Yeah. Sorry for the blunt language, guys. Yeah. Anyway, so Jess does the same thing and just continues to commit the fraud, and eventually you have to say, look, I told you to stop, you didn't stop, you're going to jail. It's a year later, and the partner says, why didn't you notice this when you're doing it last year? Like, yeah, I don't think you're suited for being an auditor. So you could lose your job for not doing a thorough job because you were trying to make excuses for problems that existed. Same problems that we identified in the situation. What if Jess did stop? What if Jess did stop? That's kind of the best of all possible worlds, right? What do we think the likelihood of that happening is? Probably not very good. Probably not very good. And does it fix the harm that she's already caused? Not really. Which again, not necessarily that we're trying to do reprisal. We're not trying to make sure that everything is fixed when we identify a problem, but it doesn't correct the problem. It doesn't fix the underlying issue, which we know was the pressure was that addiction. Okay. And I can't stress this enough because this is something we're going to talk a lot about in forensics, but it's still related to this course, is that if you don't fix the underlying problem, then you're never going to get to a solution. There was actually a very interesting story I read online about a video that was done, a movie was done, a documentary several years ago. A filmmaker gave a homeless man $100,000 and said, use this to improve your life. How well do you think that went? After a few months, the homeless man had all the money gone and was basically back living on the streets again. And the reason that they talked about that is that you gave them money, but you didn't fix the underlying problem, which was the reason that they're homeless. The reason they was having a problem was the addictions and kind of the mental lapses they had. You need to fix the mechanism before you can fix the problem. And so they actually argued that doing something like that was an act of cruelty because you gave somebody resources who didn't know how to manage those resources properly and did not have the capacity to do that. This is kind of the same thing, obviously to a lesser degree, but unless we fix the problem, we'll never get to the eventual conclusion that we're satisfied with. Boy, that's a happy note to leave us on, isn't it? Yeah. All right. Wednesday, not here. Back on Friday for quiz. See you all then.